Chapter 22 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 The Battle of Seattle. Woo! 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 An officer of the warship Decatur, who was on shore duty at Seattle on a very dark night, thought he heard an owl. This was late in January, 1856. Blackness lay over the waters of Puget Sound. Blackness lay over the shore and the nearby forests. All the people in the little sawmill town of Seattle were asleep, except a few anxious ones. Were the Indians asleep, or were they planning an attack? No one knew. Therefore the officer pricked up his ears and listened, for the hooting had come out of the forests on his right. Whoo! 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 That hooting came out of the woods on the other side. The officer listened anxiously, for the hooting of an owl was an old Indian signal. Whoo! 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 There it was again, on the right-hand side, but nearer than the first hoot. Whoo! 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 This time it was on the left, and also nearer. "No owl about that," said the officer to himself. "Those owls are Indians. I guess we are in for it." 1 year before, Governor Stevens had made his treaties with the Puget Sound Indians, and then other treaties at the great council at Walla Walla. But the Indians were not satisfied with the treaties for several reasons. The lands given them were not the best. 2 or 3 tribes, eternal enemies, had been placed upon the same reservation, and that meant constant trouble. And besides, although the Indians had given up their lands, and the white people were building their cabins, fencing the lands, cutting down trees, and taking possession, the Great Father at Washington had not sent 1 penny of payment to his Indian children in Washington. The Indians thought themselves tricked. Indians from other parts of the country who happened to come into the West told them that the white men always did so. Another reason was this: the Indians for 40 years had been dealing with the Hudson's Bay Company. Dr. McLaughlin, the White Eagle chief, and James Douglas, who followed him in the management of the fur trade, had power. If they made a promise to the Indians, they also kept it. The Indians held them responsible. When Governor Stevens made the treaties with the Indians, he made the promises. But it was Congress who had to keep them. Sometimes Congress was slow in doing this, and sometimes did not do it at all. This was something the Indians could not understand. If they had been left alone, the lazy Puget Sound Indians might have complained and been troublesome, but perhaps they would not have gone to war. They liked better to squat in the bottoms of their canoes and fish, or to camp on the shores of Puget Sound and dig clams out of the beach, or to catch crabs. But the horse Indians from east of the mountains were very warlike, and they were angry over the treaties. All these Indians knew well the difference between the King George men and the Boston men. They were not angry with the British, who bought their furs. They were angry with the Americans, who had taken their lands and driven the game away. There was danger of Indian attack on Seattle. Therefore the hooting made the officer anxious. In October of the year before, Indians had killed several families in the White River Valley, not so very far from Seattle. All the loggers and farmers from the nearby country had come into Seattle for safety. A blockhouse had been built, just a large log cabin. Women and children were to run to it if Indians came. After the massacre of October, the Indians seemed to have quieted down. Some people scoffed and said, "Oh, there's no danger." A warship, the Decatur, lay in Elliott Bay, and these people even thought it ought to go on its cruise. Others said, "Yes, there is danger. Don't you see all these strange Indians about?" There were indeed a great many strange Indians around the little milling town. They were tall, well-built, athletic Indians, bold and daring in appearance. They were very different from the short, bow-legged canoe Indians. Most people knew at once that these strange Indians were the horse Indians from east of the Cascade Mountains, and what were they doing visiting tribes whom they despised as fish-eaters? So people waited and waited, some scoffing and some afraid because they believed danger to be near. Marines came on shore, and sentinels watched during the nights. That is how the officer from the Decatur happened to hear the hooting of owls in the forest. The officer, when he heard the hooting, at once sent word to Captain Gansevoort of the Decatur. He also sent word to the settlers. Some of the leading men came quickly together for a council, and they asked Curly, as scout, to go into the forest and see if the Indians were threatening. Curly was thought to be friendly. He was gone 2 hours. When he came back, he said there were no Indians in the woods. He had actually gone straight to an Indian war council. Jim, another scout who really was friendly, came in cautiously among the white settlers who were discussing the question. Curly watched him closely. When Jim had an opportunity, he warned the Americans that the Indians had been holding a council and that they would attack Seattle at dawn the next morning. Marines from the warship were landed at once. Even with the nearby farmers, in the town there were not more than 120 people there. In Seattle itself, there were only 20 houses and a sawmill. All night watch was kept. Dawn came, then early morning, but no Indians. Some scoffed again. Those who had spent the night in the blockhouse went home, for Indians almost always attack at dawn, not during the day. The settlers went back to their houses, and the Marines returned to the Decatur. It was breakfast time, and everyone, after a sleepless, anxious night, was tired. There were no sentinels on duty. About 8 o'clock, Jim's sister, Nancy, came down into the village. Nancy was excited and was shouting something as she waddled along, for she was a very fat Indian. "What's the matter, Nancy?" called some of the settlers. "Hi, hi, 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 Klickitas, behind Tom Pepper's house!" screamed the old Indian. "Many, many Indians," was what the jargon meant. At once word was sent to the Decatur. Captain Gansevoort had had many false alarms. Some of his officers thought this might be another. "Never mind," said the captain, who had not yet had his breakfast. "I'd rather be fooled 20 times than be caught napping once." He ordered a shell to be aimed behind Tom Pepper's house. Boom! thundered the big gun. The shell screamed its way through the air over the log cabins and exploded with a crash behind Tom Pepper's house. War whoops and yells from 1,000 Indians was the answer. Then the crash and bang of hundreds of Indian guns echoed through the forests, while a shower of whistling bullets fell like hail among the scurrying settlers. For at the first boom of the gun, out from the cabins rushed the settlers. Breakfasts were left on the table, uneaten or half-eaten, or even on the stoves, half-cooked. The settlers were not all even fully dressed. And curiously enough, no one was hurt during that wild run because the Indians had to stop to reload their guns. So began the Battle of Seattle. The men who had guns went right out into the open, into the streets before their houses, hiding behind the stumps of great trees left there. The women and children were hurried off to a lumber vessel lying in the harbor, which had come in a few days before to get piles and sawed lumber for California. Seattle in those days was nothing but a few log houses scattered in and out among the old stumps between what is now Second Avenue and the waters of Puget Sound. When Mr. Yesler built his sawmill in 1853, he had built it on a little peninsula near what is now the foot of Yesler Way. The narrow neck of land connecting it with the mainland he had widened and heightened by heaps of sawdust, making a very dry little knoll there. This was all there was to the town. Up the hill from Second Avenue, much steeper then than now, was a dense forest of heavy trees, with dense underbrush, and in the forest the Indians were securely hidden and quite safe from bullets. Yet the battle went on, the steady roar of the cannon from the warship, the shrieking of the shells, and the crash of their explosion in the woods. And mingled with this uproar was the bang of the guns, the wild whoops of Indian warriors, and the yelling of the squaws who urged them on. Indian bullets cut up the ground around the Americans, tore their clothes, cut through their hats, and whistled, thick as a swarm of bees, in the air. Yet few white men were touched. The Americans aimed more accurately than the Indians, and the shells from the fire-ship frightened the warriors rather badly. They could not understand how a gun could shoot twice. That is, after the roar of leaving the gun, the shell exploded with a second crash when it reached its mark. An Indian behind a tree had a lock of hair cut off by the fragment of a shell. He said afterwards he could not understand how a gun could shoot around the corner. The fighting and yelling went on. Hundreds of Indians, just at noon, dashed down upon 14 Americans who stood at one point. The white men stood their ground, in spite of the yelling redskins who came within a few feet of them. And that was the critical moment of the day. The Americans refused to be afraid, and that made the Indians a little afraid. Had those 14 run away, the settlers would probably have lost the day. Meanwhile, the settlers fought without having had even their breakfast. The Indians did not. They ate the breakfasts they found in the log cabins and then set fire to them. The settlers, with guns in their hands, saw the flames and smoke of their burning homes. Still they fought on. In the afternoon fewer shots came from the forest. At once, as the Indian shooting faded out, the settlers feared treachery. They watched the forest more closely than ever. But when evening came, the Indians seemed to be disappearing. By 10 o'clock at night the battle was over. Indians never fight very long at a time. They like to make quick dashes. There were so many of them, and so few of the white people, that they felt sure of the quick capture of Seattle, so they brought very little food with them. Now they sent word that they were going away. But one old chief said they would be back in 1 moon, with 20,000 warriors, and kill off all the white men. The Indians admitted that 28 braves had been killed and 80 wounded, but the settlers and Marines had only 2 killed and none wounded. During the next few weeks, fearing that the Indians might come back again, the sailors pulled up stumps, made roads, and cleared the ground around the settlement. They built also a strong log fence, a stockade, around part of the settlement. But the warriors did not come back, and the next year the war east of the Cascade Mountains was ended also. The settlers of Oregon and of Washington along the Columbia River, with regular troops from California, fought the Indians east of the Cascades. There were no very great battles, but many settlers and soldiers were killed, many Indians, too. At last peace was declared. The Indians quieted down, the treaties were kept by Congress, and things were safe for white settlers again. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. How the Indians Lived. Footnote. This chapter is necessarily brief because the various tribes differed considerably in their habits throughout the vast extent of Old Oregon. But in the bibliography, citations to various works will be found which will enable a teacher or reader to get details on any tribe or section. Endnote. Ugh! They are fish-eaters. Their teeth are full of sand. Their teeth are all ground down. They are fish-eaters. Ugh! Such was the opinion which the Horse Indians had of the Canoe Indians. Of course, the Canoe Indians ate fish. Why should they live on the water and not do so? They lived on Puget Sound, on the Columbia, Willamette, Puyallup, Black, Duwamish, and many another river. These streams were full of carp, halibut, salmon, whitefish, and many other kinds, and the shores of Puget Sound were full of clams. At low water, the crabs and small oysters of the Northwest could be caught. But these fish-eaters were a lazy set, so it was said. Do you know how they lived along the fringes of the great forests that bordered the many rivers and Puget Sound? For one thing, they lived in winter in houses instead of teepees. All about them were tall trees, tremendous trees. Some of the hollowed trunks were as large as an ordinary-sized room. To build houses, the smaller of these trees had to be cut down, yet before the white men came, the natives had no tools, no axes, saws, or hatchets of any kind. These fish-eating Indians cut their trees down by burning them. They set a fire around the base of the trunk, but did not allow it to run up the tree. Then slowly, after days and nights of burning, when the fire had eaten through the tree, it fell. After it was down, they cut it into lengths in that same way. They usually used cedar trees because the wood was softer and the grain split straight. Then with great toil and care they split the logs into rough, thick boards, and with these rough boards they built their houses. If you will look at the picture of the Indian house, you will see that the floor was lower than the earth outside. Usually it was from 2 to 5 feet lower. They dug it this way in order to make the cabin drier and warmer in winter, so they could not build foundation walls. On the little raised platforms around the cabin they laid their beds of mats and skins. The fire was in the center of the house, in a place slightly hollowed out, and the boards at the end of the house, or sometimes boards in the center of the roof, were left open so that the smoke could get out. There were no windows and only the one door. Often in the cabin long strings of fish would hang about, drying in the smoky air. These huts were not at all clean. No white person would really want to sleep in one, though white people did, when visiting the Indians, if the weather was bad. Sometimes 3 or 4 families lived in one such cabin. Sometimes a band of Indians would build a very long house, 200 or even 500 feet long, and 60 or 70 feet wide, where many families could live, especially when they were holding a potlatch or gift festival. For such great houses, large tree trunks would be used as supports, and these would be carved and painted by the Indians into strange, grotesque shapes. Cooking in winter was done at the little fire in the center of the cabin, but in summer, when the Indians roamed about, living in teepees of rushes and bark or tule reeds, put up just where they happened to be for a few days or weeks, they cooked on the ground out of doors. They cooked in, what do you suppose? In baskets and boxes. The Indians cut very neat square or oblong boxes from the wood around them, carving them often, and in later years the boxes sometimes had a cover. Into such a box would be put a fish or other meat to be boiled, then cold water. After that, instead of setting the box on the fire, as we set a pan or kettle, they put red-hot stones into the box until the water boiled and the fish was cooked. Many of these tribes could make baskets of spruce roots which were watertight, and they could cook fish or elk meat in such a basket without burning it. Indian food was just about the same as that which the white people had in early days, except that the settlers usually tried to have flour, sugar, and tea and coffee, with perhaps salt pork, and these things the Indians did not have. But there were deer and elk in the forest. There were wild pigeons, geese, and ducks of all kinds on the waters and overhead, clams and crabs in the beaches, and many kinds of fish in the waters. In the earth grew roots also, of which the Indians were fond, such as the wapato, the little round, red, bitter Indian potato. But the Indians had also our Irish potatoes, because the Hudson's Bay Company had taught them to plant such, and the red men had great fields of them. They ate the root of certain ferns and the arrowroot, but the most interesting root, and one of which they were very fond, was the camas root. Camas plants liked soft, damp, or wet earth, and in the camas prairies, all through the Northwest, spring brought glorious sheets of beautiful blue flowers, blue like the flax, shining among the fresh greenness of the spring. These were the camas blossoms. When, in the fall and summer, the roots were large enough to pull, the Indians encamped around these camas prairies. Indian women waded out into the soft, wet, swampy lands, felt for the roots with their toes, caught hold of one and pulled it up with their toes. At once it floated upon the surface of the water, so they could pick it up with their hands and toss it into the basket on their back, while their busy toes were feeling for another root and pulling it up. The camas root looked like a round onion, but was slightly sweet. They were baked in the earth. Into a hole, dug not very deep, twigs, branches, and faggots were piled and burned until there was only a bed of red-hot coals. Over these, damp leaves were placed, and then the camas roots were piled in, covered over with other damp leaves, then with earth, and a fire built on top of it all. In 2 or 3 days the camas roots were cooked and would keep for a long time. Men and women dressed in blankets, made sometimes of elk skins or deer skins, or perhaps of a rough woolen cloth which a few tribes wove out of the long hair of woolly dogs roaming about the camps. There were no cats or horses or any animals among these canoe Indians except dogs. Short skirts were made by the women out of the inner bark of the fir tree, beaten into shreds and then made into heavy string-like cords. These were caught together by a belt and used as a short skirt. Many of these tribes wore hats which were woven rushes, or roots, conical in shape and ending in a knob about 4 inches in diameter, something like a Korean hat. But nearly always these hats were ornamented. Men and women wore all the necklaces and beads they could, and often the necklaces were artistic in a crude way. Bear's claws made good necklaces and proclaimed the bravery of the hunter. Elk teeth necklaces were highly valued, as were strings of hiaqua, the Indian money, or beads bought from the traders, or sometimes the small joints of birds strung in broad bands on deer sinew, intermixed with bright beads. They also cut clam shells into round discs about as large as one's fingernail, making a tiny hole through the center, and stringing these also on sinew. These shell necklaces were known as wampum, but they were not used as money, as was the wampum of the New England states. Hiaqua was the name of a shell from 1 to 2 inches long, curving slightly, hollow, pointed at one end, and entirely hollow. It was found chiefly among the Queen Charlotte's Islands, but sometimes further south on the coast. The long hiaqua was the highest value, the shorter was less. It was strung on sinew into lengths about as long as one's forearm, that is, 2 feet or less, as it varied slightly. Everything was priced as being worth so many strings of hiaqua, just as we say a thing is worth so many dollars. Nearly all the canoe Indians believed that a nice round head on a baby was a great disgrace. No one but slaves had round heads, so they said, and they tried to make their poor little black-eyed, red-skinned babies beautiful by giving them a pointed head. When a new baby came, they tied it into a baby board, as all Indian mothers do. A baby board was a wooden board, firmly wadded with soft moss from the trees. But then these canoe Indians fastened a flat piece of board down upon the Indian's forehead, so as to make a sharp, straight line from the nose to the crown of the head. White people thought this was dreadful, and after many settlers came in, the Indians gave it up. When an Indian mother was busy with her weaving or making baskets or doing other work in which she could sit still, she tied the baby board to the branch of a nearby tree, and then fastened a piece of sinew, so that one end of it was around her big toe and the other on the baby board. Thus she could rock the baby gently by moving her foot up and down and not using her hands. She carried her baby on her back, of course, as all Indian mothers do. Only white mothers take their babies in their arms. But Indian mothers loved their babies, and in the long twilights of that northern country, where the sun sets so late and darkness comes so slowly, Indian mothers in their huts or teepees would sing to their babies softly, and many a little white child has been sung to sleep in early pioneer days by the crooning song of an Indian mother, not far away, singing to her own baby. When their friends and relatives were killed in battle or died, Indians did not bury them in the ground as we do. Some tribes wrapped the body in skins and placed it in a canoe, set among the tree branches. Perhaps if the person was rich or important, another canoe was placed upside down over the first one. Other tribes along the Columbia had burial grounds. They built tiny sheds in which the canoe, or perhaps a carved box, was placed. At the head of such graves were the treasures of the person who had died, but all carefully broken so no one would steal them, or else put in the canoe and the wrapping skins. But the most wonderful things about these canoe Indians were their canoes. Every canoe was a dugout, as it was called, that is, a canoe dug out of the trunk of a big tree. Before the traders came with axes and hatchets and other metal tools, making a canoe was hard, slow work, and yet they made perfect canoes. A great tree was selected, one with straight grain, and cut down by letting fire eat its way through. Then the top was cut off in the same way. From this log they were to dig out their canoe. Slow fires were built on each side so as to eat down the big trunk. A full log would be round and would not pass through the water easily. The log had to be shaped into a V, so the boat would have a keel. As the fires ate slowly into the log, skillful workers, watching carefully, chipped away the charred wood so as to get exactly the right shape. It took weeks to make such a canoe, and it was hard, tedious work. Each tribe had men who were expert canoe makers. When the canoe was finished, it was shapely, well balanced, black as ink outside and inside. It was rubbed on the outside with reeds and grasses until it was as smooth as glass and without a splinter. Such canoes slipped through the water with great speed. Then came the ornamentation. Small shells painted red were used to decorate the inside, and perhaps a row would be around the outside also. A headpiece, shaped like the head of a bird and painted perhaps a bright green, was fastened into the dugout by deer sinews. Then a similar piece, shaped like a bird's tail, was fastened on the other end and also painted. Sometimes other queer figures were painted on. With such canoes the Indians would face any rough water, fearing nothing, and in calm weather they liked to sing, keeping time to their music with the dip of their paddles. Such were usually the war canoes, which would hold 30 or 40 men, or be used by a great chief, paddled by his slaves when he went to visit another red chief, or perhaps some trader. The northern Indians, especially those around the Queen Charlotte's Islands, were head hunters and cannibals. They had beautiful war canoes, holding often 70 men or more, and moving through the water with the speed of an express train. The Puget Sound Indians were much afraid of these fierce northern Indians, and would flee into the woods whenever they caught sight, across the water, of the war canoes. The canoe Indians were not great warriors. They really did like to paddle about lazily in their canoes, crouched on their short, deformed legs. Because they squatted so much in these canoes, their legs became crooked. They liked to paddle about in the sunshine, or fish, or camp on the beach and dig for clams. It was better for the white settlers that they were not warriors, else more blood would have been shed in the settlement of the Oregon country. Besides these war canoes, there were two other kinds, one a small light canoe for fishing, holding only 2 or 3 persons. The other, the family canoe, fairly large and wide, so that boxes and clothing and household goods, besides persons, could be paddled about when the Indians wished to move. A potlatch was a feast given by some Indian, at which he gave away everything he possessed in the world to the friends whom he invited. An Indian would send out a notice of a potlatch, inviting all his tribe, and when they came they spent days in eating elk and deer and wapato and camas, until they had eaten everything he could supply. Then he gave away his beads, his blankets, his cabin, if he had one, all the cooking boxes, and his dogs, indeed everything he had. His friends accepted it all. But after that, this man had a right to make his home with any one of them, or with many of them in turn, until he had gained other necklaces and blankets. Because he had given potlatch, no one would refuse him anything he asked for, provided that person had been invited to the feast. People say now that it was a curious Indian form of insurance. The horse Indians were of an entirely different type. They were bold, daring Indians, often very handsome, straight and tall and dignified, living east of the Cascade Mountains, possessing great herds of horses, of which they were very proud. A man's wealth was reckoned by the number of horses he owned, and these were nearly always the pinto or painted ponies, the calico ponies. These horse Indians lived in teepees, made in winter out of elk skin, and in summer, as they moved about, out of skins or perhaps of tule reeds. They used many mats. Many of the tribes, such as the Nez Perces, the Walla Wallas, the Cayuses — an Indian pony is called a cayuse because this tribe owned so many — and other tribes of eastern Washington were of very noble type. They were hunting Indians, hunting all through the Cascade Mountains and through the Snake River Valley, even over the Rocky Mountains out onto the plains where the buffalo roamed in great herds. They were glad enough, too, despite their contempt for canoe Indians, to trade with the coast tribes for dried fish, or to put weirs and nets in the river to catch the salmon as they came up. These Indians had about the same food as the canoe Indians, but more meat and less fish. Yet they, too, ate the camas root and the roots of ferns. They were fond of fighting, and were always at war with some other tribe, coming home from an expedition beaten, or perhaps tossing scalps high on their coup sticks. When an Indian killed an enemy in battle, the first man to touch him with the long stick which each carried had the best right to the scalp, because he had first struck the enemy. Coup is the French word for blow. The horse Indians buried their dead, after wrapping them in skins, on high platforms, standing alone on a plain, or perhaps set in the crotch of a tree. There were few trees in the lands of the horse Indians, for in general they lived in the brown, rolling, treeless country east of the Cascade Mountains. Each tribe had different customs and habits, and each lived its own life in its own way, until the white man came. Then all the old ways began to vanish. After several wars against the whites, the Indians went on reservations. They learned to use horses and wagons, to farm, and many of them today are good farmers. But the old days and the old ways are gone. End of chapter 23. Appendix of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix: A brief summary of the history of the Old Oregon country from original sources. Up to the time that the British colonists in America in 1778 were engaged in that great war which we know as the Revolution, nothing whatever was known of the northwest coast of America, and little indeed even of the Californian coast, except that Spanish missions had been planted there. The expedition headed by Captain Cook — he himself was killed in the Sandwich Islands and never returned to England — published a brief 1-volume report of the voyage immediately upon its return in 1780. A complete 3-volume report was published in 1784, and while this laid no great stress upon the fur trade, it verified the reports of officers and crew, whose interest had been so great that after the sale of their furs in China they almost mutinied in their determination to go again to the northwest coast for furs. In 1785 British adventurers entered the trade. First across the broad Pacific from China crept the 60-ton sea otter, Captain Hanna, who returned within 6 months with $20,000 worth of smooth, beautiful sea otter skins. That same year other adventurers sailed for King George's Sound, or Nootka Sound as we know it. Some sailed from London, such as Portlock and Dixon, others from the Orient, as did John Meares, and others from continental ports, as Barclay from Ostend. The problem with all of them was the fact that this trade in the Pacific Ocean would conflict with the chartered monopoly of the East India Company, since the best market for the furs was at Canton, China. The fur traders tried to get around this in various ways. Some secured licenses from the East India Company, which left them without danger, but also without freedom in selling their furs, and a consequent loss of profits, for all sales to the Chinese were made in the Oriental fashion of dickering. Others sailed under foreign flags, as Barclay under the Austrian. But Great Britain could not claim the results of the explorations of such, and the Britons themselves did not like it. Still others, as Meares, used double sets of flags. Meares had both the Portuguese and the English flags. Where it was safe, he used the English. Where he was likely to encounter the East India Company, or any of their officers, he used the Portuguese. Not until 1787 did the Americans appear, first Gray and Kendrick, followed almost immediately by Captain Ingram of the brig Good Hope, and many another. American ships immediately after the Revolution were lying idle, and as Americans were not hampered by the chartered monopoly of the East India Company, and the fur trade was profitable, they soon controlled the business to a very large extent. The American plan was to sail to the Sandwich Islands, cut sandalwood and get fresh vegetables and supplies, go up the coast for sea otter skins, walrus ivory, and seal skins, then go over to the South Sea Islands, barter with the natives for edible birds' nests for Chinese soups and other rarities such as bêche de la mer, and sail for China with their varied assortment of products, receiving payment in teas, silks, embroideries, and strange Chinaware, now so ordinary to us, but so quaint in those days, with perhaps a few Chinese gods to add flavor to the cargo. By 1812 or 1814 the British were fairly driven off the northwest coast. Yet it must be noted that although Americans developed this trade, owing to freedom of action which the British traders did not possess, Great Britain had scored first in both discovery and exploration, not only by sea, but by land. That is, had scored first after Spain, and Spanish explorations were very slightly known and very superficial. Great Britain, in her trading along the coast, following up her discoveries, was soon followed by Americans. On land she not only scored first, but was not followed by any nation at all. Hearne discovered the Coppermine River in the far north. Mackenzie, afterwards Sir Alexander, discovered and explored the Peace River in 1789. In 1793 he explored the headwaters of the Peace River, and followed down the headwaters of the Fraser as far as the 52nd parallel, then crossing overland to the Pacific, near the mouth of the Bella Coola River. He thought this last river was the Columbia, emptying into the ocean about latitude 46°, and named it the Tatoosh Tess, knowing nothing of Gray's discovery of the year before. The lower Fraser was later explored by a Briton of that name, but its lower mouth was not discovered until 1824, and then by the British, an exploring party of the Hudson's Bay Company. But Spain, relying upon her first cursory exploration of the coast, claimed it all as hers, and hearing in 1789 that fur traders were harboring on the coast, she immediately took prisoner British ships and sailors whom she found in Nootka Sound in that year, letting Americans go scot-free for some reason, and sent them to Mexico. The seizure almost caused war between Spain and Great Britain, but was ended by the Nootka Sound Convention of 1790. By that convention, England was granted the right to the northern section of the coast where she had been trading, Spain to the southern or California coast where she had been planting missions, while the stretch in between, from about latitude 42 to 49°, was declared to be open to traders or settlers of either nation. It must be noticed that at the time this division of the Pacific coast was made by these two nations, America made no protest of any kind. Indeed, she could not. She had no right, on any grounds, to any part of that extensive coast. 2 years later, through Gray's discovery of the Columbia River in 1792, America received, unofficially, a claim to territory drained by the river. The extent of the claim would depend upon who discovered the upper river. America's claim received some emphasis 18 years later, when John Jacob Astor, a fur trader of New York, organized the Pacific Fur Company, and sent 2 expeditions to the mouth of the Columbia. One went overseas in the Tonquin, one overland, with terrible sufferings under Wilson Price Hunt. The Tonquin arrived at the Columbia in March, 1811, and at once founded Fort Astoria. The badly managed overland party did not arrive until February, 1812. Washington Irving's well-known story of Astoria is fairly correct in its story of such events as the founding of Astoria, in the sufferings of the overland party, and in its purely descriptive work, though in the actual building of the fort it follows the blithe French-Canadian Franchère, who wrote for his friends at home, and the actual difficulties of that feat are underrated. The recital of Alexander Ross, a somber, literal Scotchman, is much more correct. Both accounts are to be found in the Early Western Travels series, edited by Reuben Gold Thwaites. But Washington Irving is not correct in his Astoria on anything which touches the rivalry between the British and the Americans for the fur trade. He practically worked in collaboration with Astor, brings out none of that miserly genius's mistakes, and blames all difficulties and the final failure upon the treachery of the American partners. Years of careful study of documents, letters, etc., as well as a thorough knowledge of the Columbia River, have convinced the writer that there was no treachery in the sale. The Nor'westers, hearing through Montreal of the sailing of the Raccoon, sloop of war, with the Isaac Todd, an armed supply ship, came down the Columbia with song and good cheer from Fort Spokane to tell the Astorians of their fate. The Nor'westers had no food and no ammunition, yet encamped just outside Fort Astoria, outnumbering the Astorian party. Most of the latter were also British subjects and in no mood to fight against their king and country for a man from whose mistakes and suspicion they had suffered so much, so the American trading party in the fort kept on as good terms with the Nor'westers as possible. No furs were bought for 9 months from the Indians by the Astorians because all trading goods had to be kept to pay the Indians for food. Ammunition was supplied to their British enemies outside, and peace was maintained to the credit of both parties. Meanwhile, Wilson Price Hunt, Astor's personal agent, was always away when most needed, and during these long months of waiting and tension, the Astorians sold Fort Astoria with Fort Okanogan and Fort Spokane to their rivals. The bargain was not to be closed until Hunt's return, and although he objected at the start to the sale, yet as soon as he realized the hopelessness of their position, he assented both to the sale and the prices. This is a fact which Irving ignores, if indeed he knew it. But the Journal of Alexander Henry, in the volumes known as the Thompson-Henry Journals, brings out the point clearly. The Tonquin had been blown up by the Indians in Clayoquot Harbor. The Beaver, by reason of an overcautious captain, never returned. The Lark was wrecked in the South Seas. A fourth ship, about to be sent out, had to be withheld. So with no ship, and with no means of getting their furs across 2,000 miles of savage-haunted deserts, with trading goods growing scarce, with little ammunition, and no food except what could be secured from the Indians with payments of trading goods, their position was hopeless. Franchère's argument of easy escape is childish. No one can stand at the mouth of the Columbia today and not understand the hopelessness of the American position. The price paid by the Northwest Company for Astor's beaver was $2 a pound, the usual Canadian or British price. Astor claimed he should have received $5 per pound, which was the highest price paid in New York, as well as by the Chinese in Canton. Sea otters were sold at a sacrifice also, as well as other furs. The prices were as high as could have been obtained anywhere at auction. Astor always claimed, on all furs, the highest price paid at Canton, China. But the Astorians were 3,000 miles from China, across a stormy ocean, with no ship, and with a naval war in progress. Values at Canton and among the helpless partners at Astoria were necessarily not the same, even omitting the expense it would have been to get the furs across the ocean, the cost of crews and traders, food, time, etc., and danger of capture as a prize, and the claim is absurd. One of the strongest proofs of the helplessness of the Americans was that the Canadian traders had not only their furs, but their fears. The Journal of Alexander Henry the Younger shows that had an American ship appeared after the sale, the Canadians could not have saved their furs. In a letter to the Secretary of State in later years, Astor claimed that the men had all become naturalized. That was utterly untrue, and the statement only made to secure himself from criticism, as he knew, when he engaged them and contracted with them, that war between the two countries was imminent. Other statements of similar nature do not bear investigation. However, to go back 2 years. In that first summer of 1811, after the Tonquin had gone north, never to return, a small party went up the Columbia to found an interior trading post. This was Fort Okanogan. The following summer, 1812, the Astorians established Fort Spokane, immediately adjoining Spokane House, built in 1810 by the Canadian Company, the Northwest Company of Montreal. Other explorations, without permanent results, were made by the Americans along the Snake River and in the Willamette Valley. On the basis of these two fur posts in the upper country, the Americans claimed the entire Oregon Valley, or Columbia Valley, in the controversy over the border. Yet the British had been ahead of the Americans on the upper Columbia. In 1807, David Thompson, geographer, astronomer, and fur trader for the Northwest Company, had crossed the Canadian Rockies, after spending years in battling against its difficulties and the cowardice of his voyageurs, who were admirable boatmen, but no fighters. He explored the sources of the Columbia and the country of the Pend d'Oreille, the Coeur d'Alenes, and the Kootenays. He came farther down, and by 1810 had founded Spokane House. At the close of the war, the Canadian fur traders were in full possession of the trade of Old Oregon, but they had no monopoly as against either British or Americans. It was a field for open competition and rivalry. Still, no American came into the country, although their ships cruised along the coast, trading in the harbors and inlets and rivers, but founding no posts and doing no inland trade. Then, in rather spectacular fashion, and only on a rather extraordinary interpretation of the Treaty of Ghent, Fort Astoria was restored to America in 1818. The diplomatic restoration was verbal, and for the fort only, not the country. Later, the Americans claimed the restoration of the country, and there was no legal paper or documentary proof of the fact that only the fort had been restored. As a matter of fact, the treaty provided for the return of forts captured during the war. Astoria was bought and paid for, even though it was through fear of capture. But the Northwest Company did not find the Oregon country one of much profit. They were in serious difficulties with the Hudson's Bay Company in the Red River country of Canada. Food and supplies and men could not be brought readily over that long, long trail from Montreal to the Pacific, including the high passes of the Canadian Rockies, and it was most expensive to send them from either Montreal or from England around the Horn to Oregon. Even without that, the trade was not well managed. The traders were always in difficulties of one kind or another with the Indians, through the lawlessness of the lower classes of servants, which made it difficult for small parties to be sent out, and hard to coax the Indians into hunting for pelts. The climate of Astoria was not good. The dampness mildewed the furs and the clothing, the mud seemed bottomless, the chilly, gray, foggy days depressed the hungry, discontented men. Officers of the company at Fort William were almost disposed to give up the country, when in 1818 they sent out Donald Mackenzie with special powers, and he at once changed loss into profit. He had been one of Astor's partners, and could have given him valuable assistance, as he was an experienced trader and possessed of remarkable control over the Indians. But Astor's jealousy and suspicions gave him no place of authority, and was one element in the failure of the Astorians. Meanwhile, owing to the Red River troubles, Parliament ordered the Northwest Company of Montreal and the Hudson's Bay Company of London to merge. This was done completely in 1821, under the name of the older and more famous company, and the fur trade of all British North America and Oregon reorganized. In 1824, having reorganized the service elsewhere, George Simpson, governor in North America, afterwards Sir George, came down the Columbia River one rainy November day with the new chief trader, later chief factor, Dr. John McLoughlin, an experienced trader, a trained physician, and a man also of remarkable character and abilities. Their immediate decision was to place their central fort in a better location, and the prairies opposite the mouth of the Willamette River were selected for the new post. The climate was drier and sunnier, the soil adapted for the raising of grain and vegetables, the fort accessible to their ocean-going ships, and yet 90 miles nearer the tribes of the upper country than Astoria, or Fort George, as they called it after the sale. Here, on the upper prairie, nearly a mile from the river, was built the first Fort Vancouver, beginning in the late winter of 1824 and early spring of 1825. Shortly after, about 1828, finding themselves too far from the water both for personal use as well as shipping, the fort was removed to the lower prairie, almost on the river bank, now partly occupied by Columbia Barracks at Vancouver, Washington. This second fort was the one so well known to American settlers, missionaries, and pioneers. Meanwhile, the United States, as shown by diplomatic papers, did not intend to give up this country on the western coast. America did not expect to occupy it herself, and even so late as 1844, after thousands of settlers had gone there, United States senators said on the floor of Congress that a separate nation must needs settle there because of the vast stretch of plains and mountains between the States and the Pacific, but it must be one of American form of government, American ideals, and American sympathies. California belonged to Mexico until within a year of the settling of the boundary problem. Year after year, one senator or another brought into Congress a bill for the occupation of the Oregon, which received more or less discussion, but failed. The Missouri senators were most vigorous in this because Missouri was interested in the fur trade, and their jealousy was bitter toward Great Britain's success in getting it. Feeling at that time was very bitter towards the British on all points. Senator Benton's false statements made in Congress, his charges that the British were murdering thousands of American trappers and traders, that they were instigating the Indians against the Americans, that they were claiming a country which was indisputably American, came near bringing America into a third war with Great Britain, and almost every statement he made, based on the allegations of jealous traders themselves, are now shown by original documents to have been entirely false. Senator Lynn tried to carry the Oregon bill because, as his congressional friends frankly admitted, his re-election depended upon his efforts in this direction, and he had no other means of earning his living than that of senator. He was a likable man, breezy and friendly, and his senatorial friends wanted to help him earn his living, so many of them, on one occasion, voted for his bill, though it was in defiance of the treaty with Great Britain. America said Oregon in these days, and thought of the Columbia River, and Astoria and Robert Gray, as well as the fur traders who had sailed up and down the coast. Great Britain said Oregon, and thought of Mackenzie and Hearne and Fraser, of Captain Cook and Vancouver, who explored Puget Sound in 1792, and of Meares and Portlock and Dixon. One country thought of the lower one-third, the other of the northern two-thirds. Each said Oregon. The geography of the country was little known. No wonder each country was surprised at the claims of the other. Even before 1822, however, Great Britain gave up all claim to Oregon south of the Columbia River. In 1818, at the time that Fort Astoria was restored, she had entered into a joint occupancy treaty with the United States, by which it was decided to allow traders and trappers and settlers and fishing vessels to trade or settle in the country, whether British or American, because they could not decide the possession of the country. This treaty was for 10 years. In 1827 it was repeated, this time indefinitely, either country to end it by a year's notice. This cleared things up, because the two other countries which had claims had surrendered them to the United States. Spain surrendered all those under the Nootka Sound Convention when she sold the Floridas in 1819, and Spain had claimed Oregon to the far north, except as limited or left undetermined by that convention. France had had rights of contiguity because Oregon lay immediately west of Louisiana, but those had passed to the United States in 1803, when she sold old-time Louisiana. Now suddenly, in 1821, Russia appeared, claiming Oregon and the North Pacific as a closed sea. This was settled by treaties between Russia and Great Britain and Russia and America in 1824 and 1825, by which the Czar accepted 54° and 40' as his southern boundary, and left Great Britain and America to settle the division of the coast between them. But it was the Spanish claims, even though limited, yet left unsettled by the Nootka Sound Convention, sold to the United States, and also this treaty with Russia, that led the American people, that is, the people as a whole, to believe that American rights extended into the far North. That led, in 1845, to the cry, "5440 or fight!" It would have been a most unrighteous war for America, for she had no more right, either by discovery, exploration, or settlement, to the northern section of the old Oregon country than she had to the British Isles. Her rightful claims were all south of the 49th parallel, and the best informed men knew this. Even in 1818, again in 1824, and again in 1827, America had offered Great Britain the boundary line of the 49th parallel, just where it is today, because America wanted the great harbors of Puget Sound. Otherwise the 48th parallel might have been offered, for we had no real right north of that. The harbors were a commercial necessity, and the country was determined to have them. It will be seen, therefore, since Great Britain before 1822 gave up all claim to the country south of the Columbia, and America from 1818 on until 1845 made no claim to anything north of latitude 49°, that Oregon never was in danger of being lost as a whole. The only section of the whole country about which there was any dispute at all was that south and west of the Columbia River, as it winds and turns like a pair of stairs through the state. That is, the only section at stake was the western half of the present state of Washington. The number of men who saved Oregon has been increasing as rapidly as the vast amount of furniture which came over in the Mayflower. No one saved Oregon, because Oregon was never in danger of being lost. Only half a present-day state was in dispute, and from 1815 onwards there was no chance of that being given up, for the statesmen, as their letters and papers show, were determined to have those harbors on Puget Sound. The Columbia was a barred river and unsafe during much of the year. San Francisco Harbor belonged to Mexico. The tradition of Whitman saved Oregon grew out of fear. Webster did, at one time, think that he would give up any claim to the Puget Sound ports if Mexico could be induced to give up the harbor of San Francisco. His opinions on this subject were the same after Whitman visited Washington, D.C. Whether he saw Webster or not is not the question, as they were before Whitman left Oregon. There was a rumor of a trade, and popular opinion said Webster was planning to trade Oregon for the fishing rights of the northeast coast. There was no truth in this. American fur traders did not appear in the Oregon country until well into the 1820s, when they trapped through the Snake River countries, and finally, by 1827, reached Fort Flathead on the northern Flathead River. Then others came, but only on trading trips. Nathaniel J. Wyeth, a Cambridge man, came in 1832, going directly to the heart of things by making his way to Fort Vancouver. He had high hopes and great enthusiasm, no experience, a small borrowed capital, and plans which looked well on paper. He had a few followers, as inexperienced as himself, some of whom deserted him en route, the rest immediately upon their arrival in Oregon. Their arrival at Fort Vancouver was late in the fall, a most interesting story, but never yet published. His ship, due in the Columbia River, had been wrecked in the South Seas. He was dependent upon the generous hospitality of Dr. McLoughlin, and the fine character of both men is shown in the warm friendship between them, lasting long after Wyeth's return to the East, although Wyeth had gone into the Oregon country to overturn the great English company if he could, or at least to compete for the fur trade. Wyeth, as stated, had a small borrowed capital. The Hudson's Bay Company was an immensely wealthy corporation, managed on military lines, with 1,000 trained men at the posts and on the trails between Hudson's Bay and the Pacific Ocean, a company which allowed 7 years to elapse, in their monetary estimates, between the time when trading goods were purchased until the furs bought by those goods were in their hands and sold. No individual, without knowledge of the trade, or influence with and knowledge of the Indians, could hope to succeed, yet Wyeth's failure was charged to the sinister influence of the Hudson's Bay Company with the Indians, although they made no effort to oppose him. Noting his inexperience and seeing him foredoomed to failure, as many more experienced men had failed, they simply made friends with him and showed him every courtesy. In 1834 Wyeth returned to the Oregon with a few men, a little experience, borrowed capital, and with plans which still looked well on paper. He had with him en route a large assortment of trading goods for American traders in the Rocky Mountains at their annual rendezvous, a feature of the fur trade well described in Irving's Bonneville. His countrymen refused to accept the goods they had ordered, or to pay for them. Wyeth, thus thrown upon his own resources, built Fort Hall, near the present Fort Hall, stocked it as best he could, left a few men in charge to trade with the Indians, and passed on to his English rivals and friends in the Oregon country. With him on this journey was Jason Lee and his nephew, Daniel Lee, the Methodist missionaries who settled immediately in the Willamette. Wyeth found his ship safely in the Columbia this time, but luck was against him. He was too late for the salmon run, and he was depending entirely on salmon profits now. Waiting until the next year, the run was only half as large as usual, and the indolent Indians had all they could do to catch enough for their own winter supplies, without bothering with the stranger. The Hudson's Bay Company neither raised their prices for fish nor lowered them on trading goods. All documents and even private letters show that they gave him a square deal. Yet Wyeth's failure was charged by Americans to British efforts to hold Oregon for the British Crown, though the British Crown was at that time refusing permission to Canadians to colonize in Oregon. Meanwhile, the Lees settled in the Willamette Valley, receiving every assistance and kindness from Fort Vancouver, and a few years later numerous additions were made to the mission, even though a fever of preceding years had almost wiped out the Indians in the valley. Jason Lee's unpublished defense of himself states clearly that he looked upon this body of missionaries as an American colony, intended to hold the country for America. Good farms received more attention from them than actual mission work, yet the mission exercised a good religious influence, so to speak, was a religious center for the white settlers when they came in, and later became an academy. Politically, however, this mission made much trouble. Jealous of the British, fearing lest the attractive country with its open, pleasant prairies and its forested tracts — for the Willamette is today a charming country — should fall to the British, Americans sent petition after petition to Congress, urging it to extend the laws of the United States over the country, and making many serious misrepresentations against Fort Vancouver and alleged British ambitions, while refraining from acknowledging the cordial and unlimited assistance in credit and supplies given them by the agents of the British Company. They appealed for aid against the Indians and others who would do them harm. In 1836, Marcus Whitman, the devoted missionary of Waiilatpu, with his charming devoted wife, with Dr. and Mrs. Spalding and W. H. Gray, a carpenter, the author of perhaps the most malicious history ever written, came over the plains and settled among a noble type of Indians near Fort Walla Walla. They devoted themselves to their work, receiving their reward 11 years later in death at the hands of the Indians, because the angry tribesmen believed themselves about to be wiped out by the disease brought into the country by the throngs of immigrants. The massacre came, be it noted, after the firm hand of control exercised by the Hudson's Bay Company had been lifted by the Treaty of 1846. The Indians knew then that the Americans, whom they hated, were to have their country. It was Peter Skeen Ogden, chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, who, taking trading goods from the company's post at Fort Vancouver, went up the Columbia at the risk of his life, and almost single-handed forced the Indians to give up nearly 80 captives, doomed to death or slavery. The letter of acknowledgment from the provisional government at Oregon City admits this fact. Meanwhile, the Willamette Valley was being settled. By 1838 and 1839, American mountain men, trappers from the Rocky Mountains, with their Indian wives and little half-breed children, drifted into the Willamette Valley, for the fur-bearing animals of the Rocky Mountains had become practically annihilated. The 1840s saw the beginning of a stream of genuine settlers crossing the plains, the prairies, and the mountains, with their white-winged schooners, their ox teams tugging at the heavy loads while the black ox goad sang in their ears. Many of the newcomers, reaching Oregon late in the fall, had all they could do to shelter their heads and feed their families during the winter, and but for the generous help given them by the blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked, white-haired man in charge of Fort Vancouver, they could not have survived their first few months of hardship in this chilly, rainy climate, after the strain of long months in crossing the continent. Many did go on to the Sandwich Islands and to California, some having changed their route while crossing the plains, and others drifted down from the north, dissatisfied with the more gloomy northern climate. The ill reports of Oregon brought down into California by hundreds of these immigrants reached the ears of British consuls and vice-consuls there, as well as in the Sandwich Islands, which was the rendezvous for every ship in the Pacific and a general center of gossip, led to representations to the British Foreign Office by their own subordinates that Oregon was not worth fighting for, that it was better to give up part of the country than to quarrel over it. Many of these immigrants in the Willamette claimed that they came to "save Oregon," came because of their love for their native land. Knowing before they came that they could get a mile square of good farming land for the asking, perhaps with some of them the word "native" might be left out. Such a man as Peter H. Burnett, for example, one of the finest characters who came to Oregon, admitted frankly that he came for the land. He was heavily in debt in Missouri, his family shaking with chills and fever, there was no trade, and his only chance for getting financially on his feet again was his arrangement with his creditors that he be allowed to come to Oregon and take up all the land allowed for himself, his wife, and each of his several children, a tremendous tract of fertile country to be had simply for the taking. Days were rough, as in all pioneer countries, but not nearly so rough as they were in many of the western states. Still, by 1843, the needs of laws were apparent, and a provisional government was formed by the Americans, and the laws of Iowa used as a basis until some settlement should be made as to the border. 2 years later, because of the encroachments and difficulties created by a lawless type of settler against the Hudson's Bay Company, the provisional government was reorganized so that the English company might join in with them without losing nationality or affecting their rights as Englishmen. This gave the company a certain protection, but gave also to the Americans the force of the company's influence and power, both in connection with their control over the Indians, as the Americans had antagonized the natives, and their trade with their system of trading posts, as well as the fact that Fort Vancouver was a necessity to the Americans for supplies and protection. Among these early settlers were deserters from whalers, lawbreakers, and fugitives from justice, old fur trappers who hated the British Company, hated the red flag of Britain's commerce, which flew over that wooden-walled fort, with the white half-monogram HBC on the lower edge of the red folds. Such men as these threatened to drive out every man in the valley who had an Indian wife. Some Americans, but chiefly French Canadians, old servants of the company who had tilled their farms for years and had comfortable houses, and threatened also to burn down Fort Vancouver. Some were adventurers from the Sandwich Islands. And with them all was a goodly number of the finest class of American pioneers, men determined, honest, hard-working, law-abiding, good husbands and good fathers, seeking better opportunities for themselves and better futures for their children. Such men as these gave the predominant stamp to the country, and by their industry developed it so that it has grown at a marvelous pace, aided by its attractive scenery and delightful climate; developed it so that a few years later other desirable men, bankers, business men, the professional classes who lacked the liking for the rough edge of a pioneer's life, followed in their footsteps and built up the country. Today this old Oregon country makes up the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, northwestern Montana, and all of British Columbia. Of all the characters which stand out in the history of early Oregon for nobility and grandeur, the most striking is that of Dr. John McLoughlin, the Father of Oregon, as he is now called, and correctly so. Sympathy, food, clothing, seeds, plows, and cattle to draw the plows, as well as supplies of every sort, were sold to the Americans at the regular company prices over the first cost in London. Credit was long; it took years to collect some of the debts, even of honest men. Most of the Americans repaid him; others did not. McLoughlin supplied all work possible for the Americans, even glutting the shingle market at the Sandwich Islands in his efforts to help them. He was an old man when Americans knew him, imperious as his position demanded, for he kept in order in a wild, uncivilized country from 500 to 1,000 subordinates, many of them of the rougher type, besides controlling and holding in check 80,000 Indians, some of whom were cannibals. Since 1829 he had picked out the Falls of the Willamette as a future home, when old age should make retirement advisable, picked it out the year that Etienne Lucier, the first to settle there, was allowed to make his home in that valley. The company were under bonds to return their men to their homes or to the civilized world when their engagement expired. So the company, in order to allow these men to settle in a comfortable climate, where farming was possible and they could provide for their families, were forced to keep the men on their rolls, though without pay. This point led to much misrepresentation by the Americans. McLoughlin himself dreaded a possible return to the rigors of the climate of eastern Canada. That the hatred and misjudgment of Americans should have embittered his later years is a cause for keen regret, for his friendship for Americans was generous and genuine. His loss of his position was not due, as is usually stated, to his refusal to drive the Americans out of the country. It was due to differences of business judgment between him and Sir George Simpson, the governor in North America, and to McLoughlin's personal bitterness towards Sir George for the attitude of the latter toward the death of young John McLoughlin, who was killed by his men at the fur post at Stikine, now Alaska. It was a disgrace to the company, as Sir George saw it, but it was a terrible blow to the father. This summary is brief indeed, but the history of Oregon is the most romantic history of any section of the United States, and the fascination of it lies in the fact that the old history still echoes through the forests and along the broad streams of the country, and gleams in the snowy peaks. The grandchildren of many a man who helped to settle the old Oregon country are still young people barely out of school. Some of a younger generation are still mere children in school. It is but right they should know its early history. End of appendix. End of Early Days in Old Oregon, by Katharine B. Judson.